My name is Jacqueline, and I will tell you my terrible story in the air. I had never been afraid of flying. At least, not before this trip. I was on my way to London for a fresh start, a new job, a new city, a new life. The plane had taken off without a hitch. The seatbelt sign went off, and I let out a sigh of relief. I was finally doing it, leaving everything familiar behind, stepping into the unknown. I sat in the window seat. Next to me sat an older man in his mid-50s, smartly dressed with graying hair and a polite smile. He glanced at me once, acknowledged my presence with a nod, then went back to reading a thick, leather-bound book. I was grateful. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. Across the aisle, a few rows down, was another man. Younger, in his mid-30s. He was different. His clothes were impeccable, his posture relaxed, but his eyes, they moved quickly, scanning the cabin, lingering too long on certain passengers. On me. I told myself I was imagining things. Long flight, tired mind. I put on my headphones, closed my eyes, and let the hum of the engine lull me into a light sleep. I don't know how long I was asleep, but when I opened my eyes, he was looking at me. Not casually, not with a passing glance. His body was leaning toward me, his head slightly tilted, his gaze steady. And he smiled. I swallowed hard and forced myself to look away. It was nothing, just a strange guy on a plane. I was thinking too much about it. Still, my hands felt clammy as I settled into my seat, pretending to be engrossed in the in-flight magazine. I could feel his eyes still on me. My heart raced, an irrational sense of unease taking over. Flight attendants came down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks. I grabbed a bottle of water, mostly to have something to do, something to focus on. When I looked up at him, he wasn't looking at me anymore. Had I imagined it? I took a deep breath, willing my nerves to calm down. It was a long flight. I couldn't spend the whole time being paranoid. Maybe he was just a nervous traveler. Or maybe I was reading too much into the lines. Hours passed. The cabin lights dimmed and most of the passengers fell asleep. I tried to do the same, but my body refused to relax. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that tingling sensation, the strange awareness that I was being watched. And then movement. I opened my eyes a little. The man was standing. He wasn't heading to the bathroom or stretching his legs. He was just standing in the aisle a few rows ahead, facing me. He cocked his head slightly, as if he were listening to something. The cabin was silent, save for the occasional rustle of blankets and the soft hum of the engines. He stood there for an uncomfortably long time. Then, as if deciding something, he turned and walked toward the back of the plane. I let out a shaky breath. Maybe now I could relax. But when I looked across the aisle again, I noticed something. Her seat was empty. Completely empty. No bag, no jacket, no sign that anyone had been sitting there. A chill ran through my body. I sat up straighter, my fingers gripping the armrests. I had been sitting there. I was sure of it. I turned to the man beside me, the older gentleman with the book. He was still awake, turning a page with careful precision. I hesitated, then leaned slightly toward him. "Excuse me, did you see the man sitting across the aisle?" I kept my voice low, not wanting to disturb the sleeping passengers. The man blinked at me, confused. "What man?" "The one sitting there. Dark hair, blue shirt. He just got up a moment ago." The older man frowned slightly, following my gaze. "Miss, I don't think anyone was sitting there." My mouth went dry. That wasn't possible. I had been there. I had seen him. I wanted to argue, but something about the way he looked at me, as if I were a nervous, delirious passenger, made me pause. "Fine, never mind," I muttered, sinking into my seat. Maybe I was exhausted. Maybe I'd imagined it all. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. 15 minutes passed. Maybe more. I kept my eyes on the dark aisle, waiting for him to return. But he didn't. Where had he gone? I unbuckled my seatbelt, looking toward the back of the plane. A flight attendant was standing near the galley, adjusting a tray. I hesitated. Would I look crazy if I asked her? But just as I was about to move, a sound stopped me. A whisper. Low, indistinct, almost lost beneath the hum of the engines. I turned my head slowly. The sound came from across the aisle, from the empty seat. My skin turned to ice. I was barely breathing as I stared at the seat, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there, no one. And yet, the whispering continued, a steady, deliberate sound, like someone was speaking quietly enough that I couldn't understand. I reached for the call button with a shaking hand. And then, silence. My breath hitched. The whispering stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I sat there, frozen, my fingers hovering over the button. Had I lost my mind? I forced myself to breathe deeply, my pulse racing. I needed to get up, move, get rid of this fear that was washing over me. I unbuckled my seatbelt, pushing myself up. And then, a hand grabbed my wrist. I gasped, turning my head quickly. It was him. He was back, sitting in the seat that had been empty seconds before. His grip was firm, his fingers icy against my skin. His eyes locked with mine, and for the first time he spoke. "Don't move." I gasped. The pressure of his grip was firm, but not painful, just enough to keep me frozen in place. I wanted to scream. I wanted to pull my arm away, to push past him, to do anything but sit there, paralyzed. But something in his eyes, something terrifyingly calm, kept me still. "Don't move," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. My pulse pounded loudly in my ears. "Who are you?" I managed to rasp out. He didn't answer right away. His gaze darted toward the front of the plane, then back to me. Slowly released my wrist. "You don't understand," he said. And then, his expression darkened. "You can't stand up." Not yet. I felt a sharp chill of fear. My mind was racing. Had I done something in my seat? Had I planted something? My stomach churned with nausea. "What are you talking about?" I whispered. The man exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. "I need you to listen very carefully," he said, his voice low, urgent. "Something's going to happen. Soon." A wave of cold terror washed over me. "What do you mean, something?" My voice shook. He leaned in slightly, and I caught a faint, sharp, metallic scent, like blood or machinery. "The plane," he said, "isn't safe." My breath caught in my throat. No. This was crazy. I wanted to dismiss him. Tell myself he was just a conspiracy nut, a lunatic playing mind games. But deep down, something about the way he said it, so sure, so strangely calm, made my stomach turn. I looked around the cabin. People were sleeping, reading, watching movies, disoriented, at peace. Everything seemed normal. But normal didn't explain the way he'd disappeared. The empty seat, the whispers. Normal didn't explain why. Even now, my gut screamed at me that something was very, very wrong. "How do you know?" I whispered. His eyes looked back toward the front of the plane, and then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Because this is over." I stared at him, my mind rejecting his words. "What?" My voice was barely a whisper. He didn't blink. "This flight. This exact moment. I've lived it before." A sickening feeling coiled in my stomach. This wasn't possible. This was some kind of twisted joke, a cruel attempt to play me. But then why did his eyes look so haunted? "You're lying," I said, but it came out weak, unsure. He leaned closer. "Look at the flight attendants." I hesitated, then turned my head slightly. The flight attendants moved around the cabin, checking on the passengers. Nothing unusual. But then I noticed something. One of them, a woman with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, was pouring coffee for a passenger 2 rows ahead. As she tilted the coffee pot, he shuddered. A single drop of coffee spilled onto the tray. She frowned. She wiped it away quickly with a napkin. A minor detail. Except I'd seen it before. Not just something similar. Not just déjà vu. I'd seen this exact moment. I turned to him, my chest tight. "What's going on?" He clenched his jaw. "We don't have much time." No, this doesn't make sense. Are you saying we're stuck in some kind of loop?" His expression darkened. "It's not a loop. It's a warning." The plane shook. It wasn't turbulence, but something deeper. A shift in the atmosphere, a subtle, sickening sensation that made my hair stand on end. The passengers shifted, barely noticing. Some of them settled back in their seats, murmuring in their sleep. But he noticed. And so did I. I gripped the armrest, my knuckles white. "What's going to happen?" He swallowed. Same as last time. The plane shook again. This time, the fasten seatbelt sign blared overhead. A voice crackled over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. We may experience some minor turbulence, so please remain seated." The man next to me exhaled sharply. "Turbulence," I repeated, my heart racing. "That's it, isn't it?" And I knew. No, it wasn't. Something was about to go horribly wrong. The lights in the cabin flickered. It was a subtle flash, just a brief, almost imperceptible flicker. But I saw it. And so did he. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "In a few minutes, the pilot will make an announcement. He'll say there's a minor technical problem, nothing to worry about." That's a lie. My breathing became shallow. "What kind of problem?" I whispered. He shook his head. "The controls. Something's going to stop responding. Last time, they tried to fix it, but..." The plane descended. Gasps could be heard in the cabin as my stomach lurched with the sudden drop. The plane stabilized almost instantly, but my hands were shaking. This wasn't turbulence. A flight attendant walked quickly into the cockpit, her face carefully neutral, but I caught the tension in her posture, the way her fingers curled slightly at her sides. The man next to me tensed. "It's starting." I turned to him, my pulse racing. If this has already happened, then what do I do? How do I stop it? He didn't answer right away. He looked at the cabin, then at the passengers, most still oblivious to what was happening, some muttering about the turbulence. Then he looked at me. "You have to trust me." The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." My fingers dug into the armrest. It was happening exactly as he said. The captain's voice was firm, practiced. "We're experiencing a minor technical problem. but I want to assure you there's no cause for concern." I turned to the man, my skin cold with fear. "This plane is going down, isn't it?" His silence was answer enough. I forced my lungs to breathe. "So why are you here? If this already happened, how do you know? How did you survive?" His eyes darkened. "I didn't." A chill ran down my spine. I stared at him, waiting for him to take it back, to say it was a sick joke, a twisted attempt to scare me. But his expression didn't change. "I didn't survive." The words echoed in my head, spinning, refusing to make sense. I shook my head. That's impossible. You're here. You're talking to me." His fingers clenched into fists. "I know." The plane shook again. A more violent tremor this time. Passengers murmured, shifting restlessly in their seats. Flight attendants shifted with forced calm, reassuring smiles plastered on their faces. I felt like I was going to throw up. "How?" I demanded. "How are you here if you—" He couldn't get the word out. He exhaled shakily. "I don't know, but I remember everything. The panic, the alarms, the way the oxygen masks never deployed." My breath hitched. I remember the captain's voice breaking when he realized there was nothing he could do. The feeling of the plane tilting, the screams. I swallowed hard, my heart beating like a frantic drum in my chest. "But most of all," he whispered, "I remember you." A chill ran through me. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. "You were here," he continued, "sitting in that seat, just like now. You were the last person I saw before." The plane shook violently. A collective gasp filled the cabin. A metallic groan reverberated through the fuselage, deep and unnatural, as if the plane itself was in pain. The fastened seatbelt sign flickered, then went out. A voice crackled over the speakers, frantic, urgent. "Mayday, Mayday." Screams rang out. The man grabbed my hand. "You have to listen to me." I was shaking, my mind falling apart. I don't understand." "This time," he said, squeezing my fingers tightly, "you can change it." The lights in the cabin flickered again. And this time, they didn't come back on. The cabin plunged into near total darkness, lit only by the eerie glow of emergency lights. A woman screamed. Someone yelled for the flight attendants. The overhead bins vibrated as the plane lurched again, tilting just a little, but enough to send a wave of panic through the passengers. I was breathing heavily. My fingers gripped the armrests so tightly my knuckles turned white. "This isn't happening," I whispered. But it was happening. The man squeezed my hand. "You have to do something. Now." I shook my head frantically. "I don't know what to do." He leaned toward me, his voice low but urgent. "Last time, the pilots tried to fix it from the cockpit, but there's a manual control in the crew section near the galley." My heart was pounding. "What?" "I saw it last time. The backup system. They didn't use it because they didn't know it existed. But I did." I swallowed hard. This was crazy. And yet, deep down, I knew he wasn't lying. Another violent jolt shook the plane. Overhead, bins flew open and bags fell to the floor. A baby cried somewhere in the back. A flight attendant struggled down the aisle, her face pale in the gloom. I turned to him. "What if you're wrong?" He held my gaze. "Then we'll all die." My throat tightened. The passengers around me gasped. A man behind me grabbed my arm. "Miss, sit down. It's dangerous." I pulled away, my pulse roaring in my ears. The flight attendant was in front of me now, gripping the seatbacks as she struggled to reach the cockpit. I lurched forward, grabbing her arm. "There's an override switch," I shouted over the chaos. "Near the galley. You have to." Her eyes went wide. "What?" "The backup system." I grabbed her sleeve. "Please, you have to try it." She hesitated for a second. Then, the plane dropped. A free fall. A sick, weightless fall. Screams filled the cabin. My stomach churned in my throat. I grabbed a seat, my knees buckling. Oxygen masks shot out from the ceiling. The flight attendant's face twisted in terror. Then she ran. I watched her disappear into the galley. The man's voice was in my ear. "You did it," I gasped, gripping the armrest, my vision blurring with panic. "It's not over," squeezed my shoulder. "It will be." The plane shook. A deafening sound reverberated through the fuselage. And then, the descent slowed. A choked sob tore from my throat. We were still falling, but not as fast. The intercom crackled, a frantic voice. "We're in control." "We're..." Static. I turned to him, my breath coming in gasps. Did we? You changed it." For the first time since this nightmare began, hope flickered in my chest. I turned to the window, and when I looked back, he was gone. My breath caught. I whipped my head around and searched through the rows of terrified passengers. The man who had grabbed my hand, who had known what to do, wasn't there. His seat was empty. Impossible. A chill ran down my spine. My hands shook as I pressed them against the armrests, my knuckles still white. The plane was leveling off now, the sickening drop replaced by a gradual descent. People were sobbing, clinging to each other, whispering prayers. The flight attendant stumbled back into view, her face streaked with tears but lit with cautious relief. "It worked," she gasped. "The override. It worked." I barely heard her. My eyes were fixed on the empty seat. I stood up and walked over, my heart pounding. My fingers reached out, hesitating, then brushing against the fabric of the cushion. It was cold. No heat. Like there had been no one sitting there. The engines roared as the pilots struggled to regain full control. My pulse hammered in my ears. The emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls of the cabin. I asked the woman standing near him, my voice hoarse. "The man who was sitting here, where did he go?" She blinked at me, confusion furrowing her brows. "What man?" I swallowed hard. "The man next to him. The one who told me what to do." Her eyes widened slightly. I was sitting alone. My stomach sank in an unnatural way. No, that wasn't possible. He had been there. I had felt his grip, his breath against my ear. He had looked at me with such urgency, such certainty. He had been there. Hadn't he? A crackling sound came from the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have regained control of the aircraft. We are conducting an emergency landing. Please remain calm." A round of muffled cheers broke the tension. People hugged each other, sobbing in relief. But I sat there, my body paralyzed and my mind racing. The plane was leveling out. The nightmare was ending. And yet, my nightmare was only just beginning. Because I knew, deep in my bones, that I had not been alone. And worse, somehow, I had the horrible, gut-wrenching feeling that this was not the first time he had been here. Or the last.
Subscribe to our channel for more scary stories. We would love to read your comments. Which story